He had his gun, so he just swung it open.
I start to notice that, the atmosphere feels a little bit weird.
First thing he seen was this 6.5 foot tall, broad shoulder, dark hair. That freaked him out.
We hadn't talked to her about like life and death and what any of that means. She's 3 years old,
So we turned around. Suddenly there's a whole tree falling across the road.
And she was describing to us that, there was a deceased person that she could see visually.
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, where we tackle the ever-expanding history and mystery of monsters and supernatural madness every Monday and Friday. You can find us at CryptidClues.ca for more information, or even check out exclusive content such as interviews and D&D campaigns at patreon.com/CryptidClues.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues. I am your host, Taylor, and for today's topic, we're going to start off by getting into the Danvers Lunatic Asylum, but the episode is going to kind of branch off into a few other asylums as well, and kind of categorizing different hauntings as best as I could with my own kind of perception and perspective incorporated into it, of course. But before we get into all of that, a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca, our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook, as well as our Patreon, where you can get ad-free early episodes there. And lastly, should you like to reach us directly, send us an email, cryptidclues@gmail.com. Now, without further ado, let's see what this first asylum is all about, with a little bit of history, of course. The Danvers Lunatic Asylum, this was built in 1874. The facility, however, wouldn't open up until 1878, 4 years later. The asylum was built in a very rural and isolated spot in Massachusetts. I hope I'm saying that right. That's one of those tricky words. Massachusetts, I think, is how it goes. But anyways, this is known under several names, though, the asylum, such as the State Lunatic Hospital at Danvers, the Danvers Lunatic Asylum, and the Danvers State Insane Asylum. In total, the cost of this facility was around $1.5 million and consisted of two main center buildings, housing the administration, and then 4 radiating wings on each side of the administration block. You had the kitchen, laundry, chapel, and dormitories for all the attendants. That was all in a connecting building in the rear. The water for the facility was supplied from Middleton Pond, and wings for both male and female patients were on each side of the main building. The outmost wards were saved for the most hostile of patients. Now, I know I'm a big fan of underground highways and such, but rest assured that's not really the case here. But the parallels exist in the sense that most of the buildings on campus were intertwined with a series of tunnels underground. It's actually a very common design feature for institutions at this time for the mentally ill individuals, having tunnels underground intersecting. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that they were allowing the mentally ill to traverse with these tunnels, but it was more or less a staff kind of special access way. Think like Disneyland, they got all the tunnels kind of underneath the park for people to kind of zip and zoom around pretty quickly and expeditedly, but I digress. The hospital was constructed to hold around 500 patients, but it could hit a maximum of around 1,000 and still be relatively comfortable if need be. Unfortunately, by the late 1930s and 1940s, the hospital was well beyond capacity. It was housing over 2,000 patients, and overcrowding was severely problematic at this point. Certain control tactics were unfortunately implemented to enforce and help assist with the overcrowding. These treatments included shock therapies, lobotomies, drugs, straitjackets. These are all very inhumane methods of control, and this did cause outside concern. So there were people that took notice of this, and especially in the 1960s, alternative methods of treatment, more humane methods, I guess you could say, began popping up everywhere, leading to deinstitutionalization, community-based mental health care, and with that, the decrease of patients had begun. So we're now at a point where the Danvers Hospital was steering downhill, plagued with budget cuts and basically wards starting to shut down as early as 1969, and by 1985, over a majority of the hospital wards were shut down and actually abandoned. The administration block itself was closed shortly after in 1989. With any and all remaining patients, they were all just moved to the Bonner Medical Building nearby. Then finally, the whole campus was shut down on June 24th, 1992. The patients that still remained there were again transferred to other nearby facilities. Now, this place being part prison, part asylum, became a breeding ground for atrocious behaviors and acts. For the unfortunate souls that didn't survive the treatments or their health unfortunately took a turn for the worst, were forever laid to rest in the cemetery the facility had on site. And on top of that, the judge that actually presided over the Salem witch trials by the name of John Hathorne, he actually resided on the land that the Danvers Institute was built upon a few hundred years ago. This has caused many to believe that it had a hand at play into the hospital's negative aesthetic, you could say. At some point, I think we will definitely be diving into the Salem witch trials. That's a whole can of worms that is super intriguing. Just looking back into that whole kind of component of 1692, something me and Reuben will absolutely do. But I digress. After many demolitions and fires, the asylum is literally just wasted away at this point. And albeit a few structures in and around the land are still standing, the cemeteries are pretty much the most prominently remaining component. There's over 770 bodies located there. Headstones have only numbers, no names. Visitors to the asylum site reported screaming, begging, and even crying, and that's just the start. Many people report seeing manifestations in the cemetery with disembodied voices attached to them. Back when the facility was open, visitors would often see patients walking aimlessly in the halls and sometimes just staring blank-faced at walls. So many ghostly occurrences were happening here that the grounds were eventually guarded to stop avid ghost hunters from entering the property to explore more. And with a place just consisting of lobotomies and just horrendous human treatment, which we're going to be getting more into as we kind of progress in this episode, it doesn't at all shock me that you're going to be seeing reoccurring apparitions just aimlessly walking around and just having a very depressed aesthetic to them. But moving on, however, that basically wraps up the Danvers Asylum. And we're going to look into the Beechworth Lunatic Asylum now. And this is located in Australia, Beechworth. 128 years. 128 years of horrific, inhumane experiments and abuse before it finally had its doors closed in 1995. It is stated that over 9,000 patients died here over the years. 9,000. I know I'm repeating things again and again, but that is crazy. It became so prominently horrific that most patients submitted to the facility never left it alive. With this much negative energy and chaos, reminiscent of the previous asylum we discussed, you can see how likely it is for things to linger on after death. So much so, the more I dug into hauntings and paranormal occurrences, it seems like faces and windows seem to be one of those most prevalent cases in general, and at this asylum, that is one of the most common things associated with it. Now, before we get into a little bit more of the history, I'm going to jump to a quick ad break and we'll be right back. And we're back. So, it submitted into the facility. It really didn't require much effort to get kind of tossed in here. It could be at the request of a friend, relative, or acquaintance, and all they needed to hold was medical certificates provided by at least 2 medical practitioners. So this is also, make sure you take into account the fact that the doctors didn't even have to examine the person. Thank goodness this was amended with the Mental Health Act of 1959, when that basically enforces the medical practitioner to examine the person. So if we're in this point in time, and let's say Reuben did something, I wasn't fond of his actions, I was mad at him, or maybe he just wasn't very safe for society, I could make a call and get 2 doctors to sign off on a certificate for me. And then I could go to the facility and say, hey, Mr. Reuben here needs to be admitted. Here's my signed certificate. And they will go off. They would throw him in a straitjacket and throw him in without even giving him a benefit of a doubt to say or speak his mind. They would just go with what I claimed. I could have been an acquaintance. And that absolutely shocks me. It shocks me. The other case could be that you are simply wandering around on your own accord and someone deems you a lunatic, not under proper care or control. You would therefore be brought in front of a justice that, 2 justices actually, that could order you to reside in such an asylum. And of course, you have the voluntary cases. Those who requested themselves to be admitted for a predetermined amount of time, mutually between the individual and the facility. The worst part on top of all this is that to get in, it was 2 signatures. This is with the justice or with the medical practitioners. To get out, you needed 8. Again, adding to the notion of how many people died here and how many people couldn't get back out, this facility is subject to many ghost tours and explorations nowadays. And some people on these tours and just investigations in general claim to see a matron doing her rounds, hearing children laughing, and even a specific individual by the name of Tommy Kennedy. He was basically seen wandering around many times by himself, and he used to actually ferry the dead bodies from the facility out. He unfortunately died inside the asylum himself. Additionally, there's also a woman who got thrown out of a window and passed in front of the hospital. Now, this facility at its peak housed around 1,200 patients at once. It was a balance of around 600 men and 600 women, and since medications weren't properly introduced until the 50s, the facility's medical staff opted for more inhumane methods like the aforementioned previous asylum. This again included straitjackets, shackles, and regrettably electroshock treatment. The rooms where the shock therapy occurs, it's reportedly where the most paranormal activity occurs. There is a wing dubbed the bullpen, which housed the more aggressively young adults between the ages 18 and 25. And whilst this facility does house a cemetery on site, there's another story that involves a man's disappearance where the staff tried their best to find him, and it wasn't until one of the facility's dogs was found chewing on a human leg near the ground's entry. This led to staff finding the man's body up in a tree, to which it's presumed that he was attempting to escape. The body was unfortunately there for so long that his leg had just fallen off and landed in the dog's reach. So between these 2 places, what is the kicker that they have in common? Yes, they were facilities for the mentally ill, but that's not the connection I'm looking for. It's the residual haunting activity. Now, this is not limited to, but something that primarily occurs when traumatic, stressful events are taking place. Murder and rape are examples on top of the electric shock therapies. We know that every action is met with another, either positive or negative action. And I'm not saying that, my negative actions will spawn positive actions, like a magnet, just kind of like, opposites and different ends working and connecting kind of thing like that, if that makes sense. It's more so like a cause and effect. So when something horrific is committed, the negative energy is literally blasted into the aesthetic and the area around us, staining and imprinting it with this event. So it becomes more of a constant reoccurring paranormal event that yields no interactions or anything crazy when visiting, because it's the event that's just occurred and it's powerfully replaying, so to speak. And that's just how I understand it, but it is subject to interpretation. There is, however, a silver lining to this. When positive energy is blasted into the environment around you, this also can imprint basically this point in time. Think of when people report ghost stories of faint music and dancing and laughing at a party. All that energy of an event blasted and just boom, stamped into the aesthetic of time there. Now, there are some movies that use this concept as the plot, driving the main character's narrative forward. Both positive and negative forms of this paranormal haunting. Of course, flamboyantly so, since it's Hollywood, but it does appear in the mainstream media. Again, we're meant to brush it off, not to think much into it, or at least think little of those who believe in it, but I digress. So, now we're on this trend of paranormal types, let's continue with some quick mentions of others, like poltergeists. Reports of these types of hauntings date back ages. I found some people saying it goes back to the Roman times. Usually, in this case, it can start with knocks and bangs, things moving around on their own, like furniture and such. And that's just the start. It's kind of like a slow burn that inevitably picks up speed. And at this point, you'll start to catch on to voices, possibly full-on apparitions moving about the area, with furniture now aggressively moving and shaking. Whilst many of the things I said are similar to other hauntings, it makes poltergeists a hard classification to crack. The next type, and this is the type that probably scares me the most, is demonic activity. I'm getting goosebumps just saying the words, and there's a lot of different footages out there that I refuse to watch because it sticks with you. It really, really does. We've heard this mentioned in movies and books, and it's true. Demons and entities, like these things are beings that have never walked the earth in a human form. Now, not to dig too much of a rabbit hole on this, as I will certainly explore this with Reuben, but what's another being of another realm that is not in human form and could have sinister intentions for humankind? I dare say extraterrestrials, perhaps. Now, I've never been in a situation where I can speak to these demonic possessions. I don't mean speak to them, but speak professionally regarding them. But what I will speak to and stand by is the main goal of what these things will try to do. That is to break you down. It is so important to hold loved ones close, stay strong, happy, and in an ever light-dimming world at times, just remind yourself that there's still happiness to be found out there. And so don't let these things prey on that negative and let them beat you down. I'm not an expert, so take that with a grain of salt, but that's just what I try to reinforce with myself if I'm ever feeling kind of down and out when I'm in a situation. Hopefully, you don't want something to latch onto, and always just reiterate out there, like, I'm protected, I am safe, I do not give you permission to follow me, I do not give you permission to be with me and my home, my loved ones. Just reinforce that because we have power, we have our voice. Now, of course, one prominently mentioned case online moving forward is shadow people. There is a place here locally that I'm still trying to stay at with Reuben at some point in time. It's got a local shadow person residing in it. But all in all, there isn't much known about this. They are different from usual paranormal ongoings, but are generally limited to a hapless dark mass, no human features, they just move around. And now we have our last haunting. And this one is regarding portals. If you go all the way back on our feeds, you can turn into our episode focusing on the Skinwalker Ranch, where we discuss portals a bit there. You can also check out our past episode about the stairs in the woods. There are things and pure, powerful energy points on this planet where I no doubt believe that something does indeed appear through and into our world. Whether it be balls of light, Sasquatch, heck, even other miscellaneous cryptids. But at the end of the day, like there's definitely these key powerful points, and whether or not we could go in, who knows? People go missing all the time, and whether these points are more prominent in national parks, again, that remains to be seen. That maybe is just the old Taylor spin kind of narrative I'm adding into there, but I'll run with it. However, I digress. With all that, let's get back into the last couple of asylums here before we close out this episode. The Lear Psychus and the Gunjam Psychiatric Hospital, the last two. Starting off with the Lear Psychus. This was opened in 1926 and consisted of 6 buildings that had room for around 600 patients. And even today, it is still considered one of the most haunted hotspots in the country. Now, most of this facility was abandoned by 1985. Between 1945 and 1959, the hospital was conducting experiments on patients with new drugs that pharmaceutical companies were hesitant to test on humans. Now, this ended with a facility name change. It is an attempt to stop the stigmatization of the people in this facility. The overall care for the patients, unfortunately, did not improve. It in fact worsened for the latter half of the 20th century. Just like the previous asylums we discussed about, this one is subject to both former patients and staff paranormally walking through the grounds and buildings. To be more specific, voices, noises, screams, crying, loud bangs, cold spots, touches, grabbing, abnormal lights, electronic interference, mists, and very powerful emotional feelings of sadness, anger, fear, and of course, the ongoing sense of being constantly watched and not being wanted. Many people have explored this place, and you can find those kind of videos on YouTube and everything like that. And it truly does have a very dark and heavy aesthetic to it when you look at the overall building. And for our last facility, this was located in South Korea. The psychiatric hospital has been called one of the most haunted places in South Korea, even being dubbed one of the freakiest places in the entire world. Now, again, the media likes to be so exaggerative and flamboyant about hauntings, and this place is subject to that, with the whole fake lore dubbed and other ridiculous narratives. But the truth is, this place was closed in 1996 and abandoned due to the economic spiral. The fact that horrible unsanitary conditions soon came to pass, that fact did not help and very much hindered on the fact that this place was going to close. This hospital did open up in 1982, had 3 floors, and additional buildings were added over time. So what is all the funny business here? It seems like domestically, this place was reported to be more so haunted, and that kind of spiraled internationally with CNN and stuff like that. And it does help that this place looks absolutely horrific. And out of the movies, of course, it just looks like a terrifying background to a horror film. But one of the rumors goes like this, that the patients all died mysteriously, thus forcing the hospital to shut down permanently. That the hospital owner and staff were committing atrocious murders on patients. This is, again, just a domestically spiraled ruse of what could have happened. Another case is that the owner actually went insane and killed himself because of just the amount of patients and just the staff and everyone just going crazy. I wanted to include these 2 cases because, again, that's not how the owner passed. There's a very different scenario, which we'll talk to about. But I want to, again, include these because it always pays to dig a little deeper and see what really happened in situations. Whilst the unknown paranormal realm is a very real thing, the only real thing associated with this facility closing was the fact that it had that serious financial and sewage problem that resulted in a serious strain for the owner and facility director. While talks were still ongoing all the way into 1997, the owner sadly passed away, not from suicide, and the facility was never carried on with upgrades and new maintenance, thus staying closed forever. The former owner's son inherited the facility but neglected to maintain it, allowing it to warp into the spooky aesthetic it is today. However, as of May 2018, the demolition of the facility took place, thus putting any actual haunting souls to rest on the land once and for all. All in all, one of my biggest takeaways from Asylums back in the day is that the 1800s and early 1900s harbor some of the absolute worst abuse of patients possible. Another example, and I'm not going to go too government bashy here. I'm going to keep it relatively focused on the topic at hand, but we just see another form of government, and I don't even want to say medical, but a group and sector of government justifying horrific actions on a population, a group of people, when they really needed just a different type of treatment. We see the documentaries and case examinations of animals, both domestic and farm-based, abused, living in horrible conditions, and you could definitely apply that to the conditions of these human beings at the time. But ultimately, is 100 and 200 years enough to change old habits and treatments? Yes, out in the public, we have stopped testing horrific drugs and disgustingly use like shock therapy treatments and all that, but I hate to imagine what's really happening behind the scenes. Pardon my bluntness, but I reckon it goes hand in hand with some of those other groups like Men in Black or the agencies involved in keeping UFOs secret, Sasquatch secret. Now, I'm not saying it's one and the same, but it's easier for agencies to operate, thus allowing a government to have plausible deniability rather than the government lead the charge on it. The way I see it, it's a whole operational front, but that's a deep rabbit hole for another day. And with that, our latest episode is concluded. Thank you for tuning into this week's Asylum Paranormal Deep Dives. I'll get Reuben back on next week. This is definitely one, his topic actually. We're going to do it together, and he sent me some interesting show notes here just to kind of focus on some of these asylums. But unfortunately, he could not join me. His schedule's got a little bit busy. But he will be back next week, and we'll be getting into some good stuff. I got some more Bigfoot topics that I think we're going to be exploring and diving into, so stay tuned. But remember, if you'd like to check out more of our content, you can via CryptidClues.ca. You can also find more of our information on social media, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And we're also on Patreon. We can get ad-free early episodes. And should you like to reach us directly, you can send us an email via cryptidclues@gmail.com. So until next time, everyone, take care and stay safe.